The first stone was the promise. Elias slid it from the riverbed, its surface slick with green algae, its weight a dense, cold fact in his arms. It was granite, smoothed by 1,000 years of water and ice, nearly 3 feet across and half as thick. He wrestled it onto the wooden sledge, his breath pluming in the sharp September air. The dog, a great black beast named Boulder, whose placid nature belied his size, watched from the bank, his head cocked. He offered a low woof, not of alarm but of inquiry. Elias grunted, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a gritty hand. It was the first of 117 stones he would need. This one was for the foundation. He hauled the sledge up the winding path from the river, the iron runners groaning over roots and fallen leaves. The cabin his father had built sat in a small clearing, sheltered by ancient pines, its log walls silvered by decades of sun and snow. It was a good house, a strong house, but it was hungry. Every winter it devoured cords of wood, roaring through the massive stone fireplace that dominated the main room, a hearth so large you could stand inside it. Most of the heat, his father's journals claimed, went straight up the chimney to warm the indifferent stars. Elias intended to change that. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke, pine resin, and the faint, dusty scent of his parents' absence. Boulder settled onto the worn rug by the door, his intelligent eyes tracking Elias's every move. The fireplace was a gaping maw of soot-stained rock. Elias took a sledgehammer and a cold chisel and struck the first blow against the fire brick back wall. The sound was a sharp, declarative crack that echoed in the sudden silence of the house. He was not repairing the fireplace, he was unmaking it. For a week he worked, dismantling the inefficient heart of his home. He pulled out hundreds of pounds of brick and crumbling mortar, hauling it all outside in a wheelbarrow. He was left with a hollowed-out stone shell, a dark cave that seemed to pull the light from the room. It was during this phase of deconstruction that Mr. Abernathy appeared at his open door. Abernathy was a man shaped by the land, lean and tough as cured hickory, with eyes that had seen 70 winters come and go in this valley. He held a pipe in his hand, its smoke a fragrant curl against the crisp air. He stared at the hole in Elias's wall, then at the pile of rubble outside, and finally at Elias, who was covered in a fine gray dust. "What in God's name are you doing, boy?" Abernathy asked, his voice a low rumble of disbelief. "Are you tearing the place down? Winter's not 6 weeks off." Elias paused, leaning on his hammer. He looked at the old man, a neighbor who had known him since he was a child. He could have shown him the journals, the intricate drawings, the pages filled with his father's spidery script detailing heat exchange and thermal mass. He could have explained the principles of a contraflow masonry heater. But the words felt clumsy, inadequate. They were not the work itself. "Getting ready," Elias said. Abernathy took a slow pull from his pipe, his eyes narrowing. "Getting ready for what? To freeze to death? You block up that hearth, you've got no way to heat, no way to cook. That's the craziest thing I've ever seen a man do. And I once saw a fellow try to teach a moose to plow." He shook his head, a slow, pitying motion. "Wait until the first snow. You'll be begging for a spot by my fire." He turned and walked away, leaving Elias alone in the cool, dusty air. Elias watched him go, then turned back to the gaping hole. He picked up his hammer. The work was the only answer he had. That night, by the light of a kerosene lamp, he sat at his father's heavy oak table and opened the main journal. The book was bound in cracked leather, its pages filled with calculations and elegant, precise drawings. He ran his finger over a cross-section of the heater he was building. A note in the margin read, "Conventional wisdom burns the forest to warm a single room. We will burn a handful of twigs to warm a whole house for a day. They will not understand. The proof is not in the argument, but in the lingering warmth of the stone. Elias closed the book. He had his work to do. The next morning he began to build. He laid the foundation stones inside the old hearth, leveling them with sand, creating a solid base. Then came the mixing of the mortar, a specific recipe from the journal. 1 part clay harvested from the riverbank, 3 parts sharp sand, and a measure of wood ash. He mixed it in a great wooden trough with a hoe, the sound a wet, rhythmic scrape. He began laying the fire bricks for the core, a complex J-shaped channel that would form the burn chamber and a vertical heat riser. Each brick had to be placed perfectly, the gaps mortared with a watchmaker's precision. His hands, already calloused from a life of labor, grew raw. He'd come in at night, hands aching, and Boulder would nudge his head under his palm, a silent offering of comfort. The work was slow, meditative. It was a conversation with his father, with the stones, with the physics of heat itself. The burn chamber was small, no bigger than a shoebox, designed for an intensely hot, efficient fire. From there, the vertical flue, the heat riser, would climb 6 feet, a chimney within a chimney, before spilling the superheated gases into a long, winding horizontal channel. This channel was the genius of it, the part that snaked through a massive bench he was building out of river stones and cob. The cob was the next stage. He marked out a space 4 feet wide and 10 feet long, extending from the fireplace into the room. This would be the thermal battery. He mixed the substance for it with his bare feet in a wide pit lined with a tarp. Clay, sand, water, and straw. The feeling of the cold, gritty mud squelching between his toes was grounding. He worked until his legs ached, piling the heavy, dense mixture onto the stone foundation, shaping it with his hands, building the bench up layer by layer, embedding the winding flue pipe within it. Boulder would watch, occasionally sniffing at the strange new structure taking shape in their home, his tail giving a slow, uncertain thump. Mrs. Gable, a widow from down the valley whose kindness was as relentless as the coming winter, arrived one afternoon with a thick wool blanket and a loaf of fresh bread. She saw the half-finished mud and stone monstrosity that now occupied a third of Elias's living space. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, Elias, dear," she breathed, her eyes wide with concern. "What is this? It's not safe, is it? You've blocked your chimney. The smoke has to go somewhere. You'll fill the house with fumes." "The smoke has a place to go," Elias said quietly, patting the smooth, damp side of the bench. He pointed to a small 6-inch pipe that exited the far end of the bench and vented into the original chimney flue, high above where the fire would be. "It goes out there, after its work is done." She looked from the strange structure to his earnest, smudged face. She didn't understand, but she couldn't bring herself to argue. She just set the bread and blanket on the table. "Well, you be careful, son. Don't you go doing something foolish." Her tone was that of a mother pleading with a stubborn child. The project drew more visitors. Mayor Thompson, a man whose wealth came from the local timber mill, stopped his truck out front one day. He was a large man who filled the doorway, his presence an assertion of authority. He wasn't there for a social call. "Heard some strange things, Elias," the mayor said, his gaze sweeping over the construction site that was once a living room. "Abernathy says you've lost your mind. I'm starting to think he's right. That thing is a fire hazard. It's not up to any code I've ever seen." "It's safer than an open flame," Elias replied, his voice even. He didn't rise to the challenge. "The fire is contained in a brick core. The outside never gets hotter than a cup of tea." "That's what you say," Thompson scoffed. "I'm telling you, as the man who runs this town, I don't like it. If that thing burns your house down, it could take half the forest with it. I want it gone by the time the snow flies." He jabbed a thick finger toward the bench. "Dismantle it." Elias met the mayor's hard gaze. He felt Boulder shift beside him, a low growl vibrating in the dog's chest. Elias placed a hand on his head. "This is my home," he said, the words simple and final. The mayor stared at him for a long moment, his face flushing with anger. But Elias didn't waver. He simply stood his ground, a quiet, immovable object. Thompson eventually let out a huff of exasperation. "Fine. But when you come knocking on my door, freezing and homeless, don't expect any sympathy." He turned and left, slamming the cabin door behind him. The only person who looked at the creation with something other than pity or derision was Ilara. She worked at the general store, and she brought a delivery of supplies, sacks of flour, salt, and kerosene, one crisp October afternoon. The main structure of the bench was complete, a great serpentine beast of earth and stone. Elias was applying the final plaster coat, a smooth mixture of fine clay, sand, and cattail fluff. She stepped inside, her eyes curious. She walked around the bench, her fingers lightly tracing its curved surface. She didn't see a pile of mud. She saw its form, its purposefulness. It was sculpted, not just built. "What is it?" she asked, her voice free of judgment. For the first time, Elias felt the desire to explain. He wiped his hands on a rag and picked up his father's journal, opening it to a diagram showing the path of the hot gases through the system. He pointed to the firebox, the heat riser, the long, winding channel. "The fire burns here, very hot and very fast. All the heat, instead of going up the chimney, travels through the entire bench. By the time the exhaust comes out here," he touched the small exit flue, "it's cool enough to touch. All the energy is stored in the stone and the earth. It releases the heat slowly, for a long, long time." She studied the drawing, then looked at the massive structure. She nodded slowly, a small smile playing on her lips. "It's like you're domesticating the fire, making it work for you instead of just watching it burn." Elias felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with a fire. "Yes," he said, "that's it." "It looks warm," she said, her hand resting on the cool, damp plaster. "I hope it works." "It will work," Elias said. It was not a boast, it was a statement of fact, a trust in his father's knowledge and his own two hands. He finished the plastering the next day. The bench was beautiful, a piece of functional sculpture that seemed to have grown from the floor of the cabin. It was pale and smooth, curving invitingly around the new, smaller hearth. According to the journal, it now needed to cure for 3 full weeks to let the hundreds of gallons of water in the clay and cob evaporate completely. During those weeks, winter did not creep in. It fell from the sky like a hammer. The temperature dropped. The winds picked up, moaning through the pines. The first snow came, a light dusting that didn't stick. Then came a hard frost that killed the last of the autumn foliage and left the windows etched with ferns of ice. Elias wore 3 layers of clothes inside his own house. It was colder within the cabin's thick walls than it was without. He ate his meals quickly, his breath fogging in the air. Abernathy was right, in a way. He was cold. But he was not without a plan. He was just waiting. The 3 weeks passed. On a frigid morning in mid-November, with the sky the color of lead, Elias decided it was time. The plaster was bone dry, the color of pale sand. He knelt before the small, insulated door of the burn chamber. Boulder lay a few feet away, shivering slightly, watching with an air of canine skepticism. Elias took a handful of dry twigs and a single piece of newspaper. He lit the paper and dropped it into the vertical feed tube. He added the kindling. For a moment, a bit of smoke puffed back into the room. His heart seized. Had they all been right? Then, with a soft, deep whoosh, the draft engaged. The sound was like a giant taking a slow, steady breath. The smoke vanished. The fire roared to life in the small chamber, but it was a contained, quiet roar, a low thrumming that was felt more than heard. There was no crackling, no snapping, just a clean, intense burn. He added a few larger pieces of split pine. The metal of the small door grew hot, but the bench itself remained cold to the touch. He sat there for an hour, feeding the small, hungry fire. According to the journal, the initial firing was meant to warm the core and establish the draft. After an hour, he let it die down. The cabin was still cold. He felt a flicker of doubt. He banked the embers and went outside to split wood, the rhythmic work a balm for his anxiety. When he came back inside an hour later, he felt it, a subtle change in the air. He walked over to the bench and placed his palm on the plaster surface nearest the fireplace. It was warm. Not hot, just a distinct, pleasant warmth, like a sun-baked stone in late afternoon. He walked the length of the bench, touching it. The warmth was spreading, a slow thermal wave moving through the hundreds of pounds of stone and earth. Boulder, sensing the change, got up, stretched, and laid his heavy body against the base of the bench, issuing a deep sigh of contentment. That evening, Elias lit the second fire. This time, he used 2 small split logs of seasoned oak. The whoosh of the draft was immediate, the burn clean and silent. He let them burn down to coals over the course of 2 hours, then closed the insulated door to the firebox, sealing the system. The bench grew warmer, radiating a gentle, pervasive heat. It was nothing like the scorching, temporary blast from a normal fire. This was a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to soak into his bones, into the very walls of the cabin. He went to bed not under 3 blankets, but 1. The next morning, the windows were clear of frost. The air in the cabin was a comfortable 68 degrees. The bench was still radiating heat as if it had a life of its own. He cooked breakfast on the small cast-iron plate he'd built into the surface above the burn chamber. It was a perfect, self-contained system. He did not light a fire that day, or the next. For 48 hours, the single firing from 2 logs kept the entire cabin warm. On the 3rd day, the temperature inside finally began to dip. That evening, he took a single, medium-sized log, split it in half, and fed it into the chamber. That was all it took. The cycle began again. The first great storm of the winter was predicted on the radio, but no one was prepared for what came. It began with snow, thick and heavy, driven by a wind that shrieked like a banshee. It fell for a full day, piling in drifts that buried fences and blocked roads. Then the temperature plummeted, and the snow turned to ice. A thick, clear coating encased everything: trees, houses, power lines. The world outside Elias's window became a glittering, beautiful, and deadly landscape. He heard the first crack in the middle of the night. It sounded like a rifle shot. A massive pine branch, heavy with ice, had snapped. Then came another, and another. Soon after, the lights flickered and died. The hum of the refrigerator ceased. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the howl of the wind and the percussive crack of the forest breaking around him. Elias was not worried. He sat on the warm bench, Boulder's head resting on his knee, and listened to the storm. The cabin was an island of warmth and light in a world of frozen chaos. He had a month's worth of food, a full cistern of water, and a heating system that required no electricity and barely any fuel. He was ready. He did not expect visitors. But 2 days into the storm, a frantic pounding shook his door. He opened it to a figure caked in snow, his face rimed with ice. It was Mr. Abernathy. He stumbled inside, shivering violently, his face pale with cold and fear. "My flu," he stammered, his teeth chattering. "The ice, it must have cracked the flue. House filled with smoke, had to get out. The fire, it's out. It's so cold, Elias, so cold." Elias guided him to the bench. The old man sank onto it, his body slumping with relief as the deep warmth seeped into him. He looked around the cabin, his eyes wide with disbelief. There was no fire, no smoke, no roaring blaze, just a profound, steady warmth. He looked at Elias, his expression a mixture of awe and shame. "How?" was all he could manage to whisper. Elias simply handed him a thick wool blanket and a hot cup of tea he'd brewed on the stovetop. Abernathy was the first. Later that day, the Gables arrived, their propane tank empty, their house like an icebox. Mrs. Gable burst into tears at the feeling of the warmth. By nightfall, 4 more families had struggled through the drifts, following the single column of clean, pale smoke rising from Elias's chimney. The mayor was among the last to arrive. His modern house with its diesel generator had failed, its pipes frozen and burst. He came not with arrogance, but with a quiet, desperate humility, his wife and 2 young children in tow. Elias's small cabin became a sanctuary. It was crowded, with 16 people and 3 dogs packed inside, but it was warm. The air was fresh and clean. Elias would feed 2 small logs into the heater in the evening, and for the next 24 hours, the bench would radiate its gentle, life-saving heat. He shared his food, his blankets, his quiet strength. He tended to a child's frost-bitten fingers. He listened to the stories of fear and cold. He never once said, "I told you so." He didn't have to. The proof was all around them, a silent, warm testament. They sat on the bench his neighbors had called foolish, and its warmth saved them. The storm raged for 4 days. When it finally broke, the world was silent and white and broken. The sun shone on a landscape of devastation. The people emerged from the cabin like survivors from a shipwreck, blinking in the bright light. They looked at their own dark, cold, damaged homes, and then back at Elias's small cabin, which stood untouched, a beacon of resilience. In the weeks that followed, as the community dug out and began to repair, a new kind of work began. Mayor Thompson, a changed man, approached Elias not with a threat, but with a request. "Will you teach me?" he asked, his voice heavy with respect. "My house is ruined. I want to rebuild it the right way." Elias nodded. He brought out his father's journals. Mr. Abernathy sat on the bench one afternoon, long after everyone else had gone home. He watched Elias splitting kindling, his movements economical and sure. "I was wrong," the old man said, his voice quiet. "What my 70 years taught me was how to survive the winter. What your father taught you was how to live in it. I'm sorry for what I said." "No need," Elias said. "You were just looking out for me." That spring, Elias did not work alone. He helped Mr. Abernathy build a masonry heater in his repaired home. The mayor hired a crew, but insisted Elias oversee the construction of a large heater in his new house. Ilara, who had spent the storm at her family's store, came to the cabin with notebooks and pens. Together, they spent the long evenings translating his father's dense, technical journals into simple, clear plans that anyone could understand. They worked at the great oak table, their hands sometimes brushing, a new, quiet warmth building between them. The knowledge spread. The next winter, there were 3 Elias stoves in the valley. The year after, there were 10. They became a feature of the local architecture, a symbol of a community that had learned a hard lesson and chosen a wiser path. The houses no longer fought the winter. They embraced it, capturing the energy of a small fire and holding it for days. The valley grew quieter, the air cleaner, the stacks of firewood smaller. The years passed as seasons do, each turning into the next with a gentle, inexorable rhythm. Elias and Alara married in the cabin, standing before the warm hearth. They raised 2 children in that small, warm space, their laughter echoing off the log walls. Elias never sought fame or fortune for his father's invention. When people from other towns came to ask, he gave them the plans freely. The knowledge, he said, belonged to anyone who needed to be warm. Boulder grew old. His great black muzzle turned a soft, distinguished gray. His movements became slow and deliberate. He spent most of his days sleeping on the masonry bench, his favorite spot in the world. One autumn morning, Elias woke to find him still lying there, peaceful and motionless. He had died in his sleep, in the heart of the warmth he had watched his master create. Elias carried his old friend in his arms, his weight now a sorrowful burden, and buried him under the tall pine that overlooked the valley. The loss was a quiet, deep ache, marking the passage of an era. Elias himself grew old. His hair turned the color of winter snow, but his hands remained strong and capable. He became an elder in the valley, a man of few words but deep wisdom. He was a living link to the great storm, to a time when the community had faced its own end and been saved by a simple, elegant idea. He taught his grandchildren how to read the weather, how to stack wood, how to mix clay and sand. He taught them that the most powerful solutions are often the quietest. Decades after he laid the first stone, Elias died on a cold winter's night, in his own bed, in the cabin his father had built. Alara was by his side, her hand on his. The room was filled with the same gentle, radiant warmth that had been his life's work. The fire in the heater's belly had been fed that morning. It would keep the house warm for 2 more days, a final, faithful act of service. Many years later, another family lived in the old cabin. Children ran across the worn wooden floors, their laughter a bright sound in the quiet woods. The masonry bench, its plaster surface worn smooth and dark with the patina of age, was the heart of their home. It was where they gathered on cold nights, where they read stories, where they dried their wet mittens. It was a permanent part of the house, as essential as the walls and the roof. Outside, under the great pine tree, stood 2 simple fieldstone markers, green with moss. One was small and low to the ground. A visitor would have to brush away the pine needles to read the faded, hand-carved letters. Boulder, a good dog. The other stone stood taller, weathered but upright, a silent sentinel watching over the valley. Its inscription was just as simple, just as true. Elias Thorne, he kept us warm. The cabin stood, solid and enduring against the wind and the snow. It was more than a house. It was a monument, not to a man, but to an idea, that a little warmth held onto and shared could last for a very long time.